Before we begin, do you have a theory about this case or a story of your own? Leave a message on our socials. Our handles are all just Nightwatch Files without the space, or head over to nightwatchfiles.com to find them all in one place. Your insights might be featured in a future episode. I'm Harper Finley, and this is Nightwatch Files. December 29, 2005. Timmy Tordai finishes his shift at the post office cafeteria and takes a bus downtown. He gets off near 9th Avenue and Woodland, puts on his headphones, and walks toward the Life Cycle's halfway house. A .22 caliber bullet strikes him in the back of the neck and exits under his ear. Tordai, spewing blood, forces himself to walk past an abandoned church to reach the halfway house lobby, where a staffer calls 911. A few blocks away, Marco Carrillo is found dead on the southwest corner of 10th and Jefferson, 222 bullet wounds. Jose Ortiz is found dead on 10th just north of Adams, 122 bullet wound. At the Travis residence, retired Lieutenant Colonel Ronald Travis hears two pops followed by a loud cry. He runs to the backyard where he and his wife find their dogs, Martin and Peyton, shot. Only Martin will survive. On Van Buren Street, Clarissa Rowley sees a car slow down. She assumes it's a customer. The car passes her, turns down a side street, returns, executes a U-turn, and approaches her in the center lane. She sees a shotgun barrel rise in the driver's window. She holds up her hands to shield her face. The pellets spray into her fingers and palms. Marsha Wilson is walking her two dogs, Cherokee and Charlie, along the northern edge of Los Olivos Park when a small car approaches from the east, then swerves into the wrong lane. A loud boom from a shotgun. Cherokee, an Australian shepherd, is hit by the blast. The car backs up before driving away. 5 separate crime scenes. 4 humans shot. 3 dogs attacked. 2 dead men downtown. 1 night of terror in Phoenix, Arizona. 7 months earlier in May, Tony Mendez had been shot through the heart while delivering candles to a family without electricity. He died trying to help his neighbors. 8 months later, in August 2006, Robin Blasnek would be walking to see a friend in Mesa when a silver Toyota Camry pulled into the opposite lane and fired a .410 shotgun through the driver's side window. She died on the scalding pavement, cradled in the arms of a neighbor who heard her scream. Between those 15 months, Phoenix became a hunting ground. Phoenix, Arizona. Late evening of May 17, 2005. Tony Jr. Mendez was 38 years old, a good neighbor, the kind of person who noticed when others were struggling. On this particular night in mid-May, he moved through the house he shared with his roommate, Ricky Kemp, searching for something specific: candles. He knew a family nearby, people he cared about, who'd lost their electricity. In the Arizona heat, without air conditioning, the nights could be unbearable. Tony wanted to help. He found what he was looking for and prepared to leave. Ricky helped him hook up a small trailer to Tony's bicycle, the easiest way to transport the supplies. But as Tony got ready to go, Ricky remembered something: water bottles. He ducked back inside to grab them. Tony didn't wait. He pedaled off into the night, whistling as he went. What Tony Mendez didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that someone was watching, following, staying back, careful, 2 blocks behind. Tony cleared a pothole in the road ahead of him. His bicycle's headlight caught the glow of a street lamp. He aimed toward it. A trigger was pulled. The .22 caliber bullet struck Tony Mendez through the heart. At 10:55 p.m., Marcos Portillo turned the corner from Encanto onto 48th Lane. He'd just finished his shift as a custodian and was heading home. The street was quiet. No traffic, nothing unusual. He pulled into his driveway and went inside to shower. 15 minutes later, Portillo stepped back outside to water his lawn and have a cigarette. That's when he saw it, a figure lying sideways on top of a bicycle in the middle of the street. Portillo ran toward the person, instinct overriding caution. He needed to help. But when he was about 5 feet away, other people emerged from the darkness, stepping into the street. "Don't touch him," they told him. Blocks away, Ricky Kemp stood in his carport, still holding the water bottles. He'd been debating whether to catch up with Tony, to follow him on foot. Then friends from the neighborhood appeared, their faces grave. Someone was dead on 48th, they told him. They'd recognized the trailer attached to the bicycle. At first, they'd feared the victim was Ricky himself. Kemp rushed to the scene. Police were already there, lights strobing against the dark. The officers initially assumed the victim had suffered a heart attack or been struck by a car. Then the paramedics turned the body over. There was a small bullet hole in Tony Mendez's shirt. They tried to revive him. They failed. Ricky Kemp identified his friend to the 911 responders. Tony Mendez, who'd left the house whistling, who'd gone to bring candles to a family in need, was dead in the street, shot through the heart by a .22 caliber weapon. Reginald Remillard was 56 years old, a Vietnam veteran living with schizophrenia. His life had become a circuit of hospitals and assisted living facilities, of medications and supervision. On May 23rd, while being transferred to a new facility, Remillard made a decision. At a stoplight, he opened the door of the transport vehicle and ran. He called his family later to tell them he was fine. They warned him it wasn't safe. But Remillard had his routines, his familiar places, and he returned to one of them. By late evening on May 24th, he'd made his way to the intersection of 7th Avenue and Camelback Road. There was a bus bench there with a small roof, what Remillard called his favorite open-air bed. He took off his tennis shoes, settled onto the bench, and prepared to sleep. Across the street, James Hernandez and a friend exited the cinema where they'd just watched Star Wars: Revenge of the Sith. It was well past midnight now, approaching 1 in the morning. They walked to Charlie's, a bar across from the bus bench, and went inside to shoot pool. Around 1 a.m., Hernandez and his friend finished their game and stepped back out onto the sidewalk. They stood on the south side of Camelback Road, debating whether to walk to another bar. Hernandez faced the street, looking at his friend. The bus bench where Reginald Remillard slept was directly in his line of sight, just behind his friend's shoulder. They were mid-conversation when a loud blast tore through the night air. Both men froze, afraid there would be more shots. A light-colored vehicle passed them, heading westbound on Camelback Road. Across the street on the bench, Remillard crumpled. Hernandez and his friend ran across the street. At first, Hernandez thought a sprinkler had broken. There was a strange gurgling sound, water-like. Then he smelled the blood. The sound was coming from Remillard's neck. Blood shot out in rhythmic pulses. Swoosh, like a fountain, Hernandez would later recall. He fumbled for his phone and called 911. Before dispatch could even broadcast the call, Phoenix police officer Darren Birch happened to drive through the intersection. He saw a man waving frantically, screaming. Someone's dying, someone's bleeding. Birch pulled into the strip mall's side parkway and approached the bench. Reginald Remillard lay face up, eyes open but unfocused, his skin turning gray. A pool of blood roughly 6 feet in diameter had spread across the ground. Remillard's tennis shoes, the ones he'd taken off before lying down, were soaked in it. Officer Birch assessed the situation instantly. The carotid artery had been severed. Remillard was bleeding out. Birch grabbed one of the tennis shoes, jammed the rubberized tip into the hole in Remillard's neck, and pressed down hard. With the shoe blocking the wound, Remillard's color began to return. His eyes focused. He looked at Officer Birch. Hernandez leaned over the injured man, his voice urgent. "Hang in there." Paramedics arrived and transported Remillard to the hospital. For 6 days, he lingered. On May 30th, 2005, Reginald Remillard died from his injuries. Sometime during the night of June 29th, while most of Phoenix slept, 3 separate shootings occurred in quick succession. First, a Burger King restaurant, 1 block north of a Jack in the Box on McDowell Road in Tolleson. Someone shot out a window. Specifically, a window painted with a clown character. The bullet punched through the clown's blue thumb. An alarm triggered, alerting the security company. Bullet fragments would later be found in the children's play area inside. Second, Sarah Moon, a bay quarter horse, stood in her pasture in Tolleson. She'd been visited by her family, the Bergmans, just hours earlier at 6 in the evening. Now, alone in the darkness, she was shot 4 times with a .22 caliber rifle. She would be found dead the next morning. Third, David Estrada, 20 years old, walked along a sidewalk in Tolleson, not far from the Jack in the Box. Someone shot him in the chest and head with a .22 caliber weapon. He collapsed where he stood. At 3 a.m., Vicente Espinoza Verdugo pulled into the Jack in the Box drive-thru with his mother and sister. They ordered food, received it, and began to pull away. Their headlights swept across the sidewalk. There was a body sprawled across it. Espinoza Verdugo turned the car around, drove back to the restaurant window, and told the cashier what he'd seen. He called the police. Cell phone records would mark the call at 3:19 a.m. At 3:33 a.m., firefighters pronounced David Estrada dead at the scene. Officers from both Phoenix and Tolleson police departments met at a nearby Circle K to determine jurisdiction. The jurisdictional boundary ran through the area, a common complication in metropolitan Phoenix. They measured carefully. David Estrada's body lay within Tolleson Police Department's jurisdiction by a margin of 8 feet. While Tolleson officers strung up crime scene tape, they received another call. The Burger King, just a block away. This scene, they determined, fell within Phoenix's jurisdiction. At 4 a.m., Tolleson detective Ron Rock was called out of bed and summoned to the scene. He ordered that Estrada's body be left in place until sunrise. Better lighting for photographs, better visibility for evidence collection. While Rock stood at the homicide scene, his phone rang again. An animal control officer. There had been a horse shooting nearby. As the sun rose over Tolleson, the scope of the night became clear. A restaurant window, a quarter horse, a young man, all shot with .22 caliber weapons, all within blocks of each other. By 1:30 p.m., the Arizona Department of Public Safety Fingerprint Lab had identified the victim as David Roy Anthony Estrada. Detectives found a phone number written on a note in Estrada's pocket and called it. A man answered, James Carlos McCormick, David's cousin. Detective Rock arranged to meet McCormick at a Chevron station in Central Phoenix. Rock delivered the news. Then Rock and McCormick drove together to the Estrada family home at the foot of Squaw Peak. They needed to inform David's mother, Rebecca. A priest was called to the house. Carl and Amy Zolcharnik were asleep in their Avondale home when the shots rang out. It was just after midnight on July 20th, 2005. Their granddaughter wasn't staying with them that night, but their dog Whiskey was, a dark reddish-brown Akita with a black face, sleeping in the yard beneath the corner bedroom window. The sound came from the street, toward the southeast corner of the house. 3 shots, the couple believed. They ran outside and found Whiskey wounded. Carl called the police, while Amy bundled the weakening dog into their vehicle. She drove through Phoenix, searching for help, finally locating a 24-hour emergency veterinary clinic. The clinic demanded $1,200 cash up front to treat the dog. The Zolcharniks didn't have it. While Amy desperately searched for veterinary care, Phoenix police officers arrived at the Zolcharnik residence. They contacted the Tolleson Police Department. Tolleson had been experiencing similar shootings. Detective Ron Rock responded and collected 2 .22 caliber shell casings from the scene. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. When Amy's regular veterinarian opened for business at 7 that morning, she rushed Whiskey there. But too much time had passed. The internal bleeding was too severe. Whiskey was euthanized. That same morning at dawn in Tolleson, Rick Swear discovered his 2-year-old painted horse, Apache, lying down and bleeding in his backyard. Dr. Mark Fink arrived and probed the wounds with stainless steel rods. He looked at Rick Swear and said, "I think he's been shot." Rick loaded the bleeding horse into a transport and drove 30 miles to Dr. Fink's facility in Chandler for x-rays and surgery. Dr. Fink performed the operation while Apache stood under partial sedation. Rick stayed next to the horse throughout, soothing him while the veterinarian cut into Apache's back to retrieve a bullet that had nicked the animal's lung. In the Tolleson enclave, neighbors began to whisper. Gang initiation rituals, some suggested. It seemed as plausible an explanation as any. 5 days later, on the morning of July 25th, Linda Wilkinson returned from visiting her pasture at the Tolleson Farms Equestrian Enclave in Tolleson. She walked into her kitchen and told her husband, Stan, "Buddy's acting like he's been hit in the head by a 2x4. Buddy was a wild burro the Wilkinsons had adopted from the Bureau of Land Management. He was hanging his head low, and his head was swollen. Dr. Tracy Hulse, a large animal veterinarian, arrived at the property. Buddy had a high fever and a bloody, infected wound. Dr. Hulse examined the burro carefully and identified a small caliber bullet hole entering through the base of Buddy's right ear, penetrating the base of the skull. The bullet hadn't exited. It also hadn't penetrated the brain. Dr. Hulse cleaned the wound and prescribed antibiotics and anti-inflammatories. She instructed Stan on how to trick the burro into taking the medicine by hiding the pills inside hollowed-out carrots. Just after lunch that same day, Deborah Haddock arrived at her late mother's property in Tolleson to feed the animals. She filled a bucket with apples and carrots and walked into the pasture. Little Man, a gray and cream miniature pony, was lying on his side. This was unusual. Horses don't typically rest in that position. Deborah moved closer. Little Man was motionless. He'd been shot. Somewhere in the same area, at some point that same day, another quarter horse was shot and killed with a small caliber weapon. Stan Wilkinson treated Buddy with the medicated carrots as instructed. The burro recovered, though the bullet remained embedded in his skull. A neighbor, Tony Morales, eventually pulled a clump of blood from Buddy's ear and showed a television reporter, Lou Ruggiero, the visible rim of the bullet still buried in the wound. Veterans Day, November 11th, 2005. The weather in Phoenix was balmy and beautiful, around 75 degrees, a stark contrast to the brutal summer heat that had passed. The comfortable evening drew people and animals outdoors. In Glendale, around 9:30 that night, Isaac Crudup was inside his home watching television when he heard his dog barking. Shep, a 1-year-old Anatolian shepherd, was agitated near the south fence along a frontage road to Camelback. Crudup heard a vehicle pause, then a shot. Shep had been hit by a .22 caliber bullet. Crudup took the dog to a veterinarian and managed to retrieve the bullet. He tried to turn it in to the Glendale police, but no one was available to receive it on the weekend, so he locked it in his desk drawer. 18 minutes later, at 9:48 p.m., 13-year-old David Cecina was sitting inside his brother's Ford F-150 truck in the carport of their Glendale home. He wanted privacy to talk on his cell phone, and the truck's tinted windows and a nearby palm tree concealed him from the street. David watched a blue 4-door sedan stop in front of the house. He saw a hand resting on the passenger windowsill, then a long barrel emerging from the car's interior. The shooter fired twice at the family dog, Irving, then fired a third shot at the truck. The bullet narrowly missed the teenager. Irving ran on 3 legs but survived. Later that night, the attackers moved from the west side suburbs to downtown Phoenix. Around 10:20 p.m., at the intersection of 20th Street and Monroe, a homeless man named Nathaniel Schaffner was drinking beer on the corner. He saw a car pull up and aim a weapon at a stray dog. Emboldened by alcohol, Schaffner stepped forward and yelled at the driver, "Hey, what do you think you're doing? Leave that dog alone, you Bill Clinton-looking motherfucker." An hour later, off-duty officer Christopher Scranton saw Schaffner lying in the gutter, surrounded by beer cans and what appeared to be vomit. Assuming Schaffner had simply passed out drunk, Scranton called for a drunk tank pickup, not wanting to expose his wife to the dangerous neighborhood. When paramedics arrived, they discovered the truth. The vomit was blood, and the beer smell came from cans pierced by shotgun pellets. Schaffner was alive but unresponsive. He was rushed to the hospital where trauma specialists worked to repair the damage from the metal pellets. 27 hours later, Nathaniel Schaffner died. The stray dog he'd tried to protect was unharmed. When a detective arrived at the scene an hour after the shooting, the dog was found eating a bag of Cheetos it had stolen from the victim. In the span of a single evening, the violence had escalated from animals to humans. 6 weeks passed. On the evening of December 29, 2005, the violence exploded across Phoenix in what would become the most concentrated night of terror yet. Around 7 that evening in Tempe, Annette Prince prepared to leave her bartending class at ABC Bartending School. Prince was in the Federal Witness Protection Program, hiding from a violent group. When she exited the building, she froze. Her gold Chevy Cavalier had been riddled with bullets. The windshield was shot out, at least 5 rounds from a .22 caliber weapon. Across Phoenix that same evening, Dr. Gudars Vasig was wrapping up his day at his chiropractic office on 32nd Street north of Indian School. A .22 caliber bullet tore through the plate glass front window, flew across the lobby, and lodged in the opposite wall. Vasig called the police, fearing he'd been targeted in a hate crime because of his Iranian heritage. At the Travis residence, retired Lieutenant Colonel Ronald Travis was in his hobby room working on genealogy when he heard 2 pops followed by a loud cry. He ran to the backyard where he and his wife found their dogs, Martin and Peyton, shot. Only Martin would survive. Nearby, Ricardo Lopez and his wife were awakened by gunshots and squealing tires. Lopez discovered his German Shepherd mix had been shot. Around 10 p.m., the violence began near Los Olivos Park, where a passing car fired a shotgun at Marcia Wilson walking her dogs, killing one of them. By 10:30, downtown Phoenix had been hit. Timmy Tordai was shot in the neck while walking to a halfway house but survived long enough to reach help. Nearby, Marco Carrillo and Jose Ortiz were both found dead, each killed by .22 caliber gunfire. In the early morning hours on Van Buren Street, a car slowed near Clarissa Rowley, a U.S. Marine working as a prostitute, then doubled back. As it approached again, a shotgun was raised from the driver's window and fired. The blast shredded her hands, but she survived. Cliff Jewell was born in Scottsdale, Arizona in 1952. When he was 2 years old, he reached for the moving blades of a fan, and the accident snapped off the tip of his left ring finger. His mother rushed him toward the emergency room, but when a local physician's office turned them away, she began speeding through traffic. A trooper in a black uniform pulled her over, but when he saw the bleeding child, he put away his ticket book and provided a high-speed escort with sirens and flashing lights all the way to the hospital. The toddler, despite his injury, was transfixed by the flashing red and blue lights, and the trooper, who seemed like a giant to the small child. Years later, Jewell would say, "From that moment on, I never wanted to be anything else but the tall guy with the uniform and the flashing red and blue lights." As a young man, Jewell joined the U.S. Army Security Police, a unit charged with protecting soldiers and civilians in military-related venues using security and combat techniques. In March 1975, he arrived in Thailand. 2 months later, in May 1975, Jewell's unit was assigned to a high-stakes rescue mission for the merchant mariners aboard the civilian ship USS Mayaguez, which had been seized by the Viet Cong. Jewell and his unit boarded a large helicopter for deployment, but at the last minute, a superior officer pulled him off the transport because his arrival paperwork from Lackland Air Force Base hadn't been properly processed. An hour after Jewell was removed from the flight, the helicopter disappeared over the jungles of Thailand with no survivors. Jewell, distinguished by his missing fingertip, was the only man from his group to leave Southeast Asia alive. In 1976, Jewell retired from the U.S. Army and returned to Phoenix. His experience as a security police officer made him a highly desirable hire for the Phoenix Police Department, and he joined the Homicides Division. By adulthood, he stood 6 feet 3 inches tall, fulfilling his childhood ambition to be the tall guy in uniform. Over the years at Phoenix PD, Jewell became known as the pet detective thanks to his soft spot for animals. One day, a relative who worked in a veterinary office called him with a story about a dog slated for premature euthanasia. The veterinarian didn't want to perform the procedure, and the entire office was searching for a new home for the animal. Jewell brought the dog home to join a household that already had 2 other dogs. He would later recall with some self-exasperation that both he and the new dog had a limb in a sling at the same time, bonding while they recovered together. By 2005, Jewell had 3 grown sons and was known as a scene guy who loved digging into the nooks and crannies of a crime scene for forensic evidence. His quiet manner masked what colleagues described as deadly efficiency. Sometime in late 2005, Jewell was called to what appeared to be a suicide involving a woman named Naomi. Known for his meticulous nature, Jewell was puzzled by certain aspects of the scene. He traced her purchase of ammunition from earlier that day and located her cache of bullets. When he counted them, he realized several were missing, more than could be accounted for by her suicide alone. Concerned that the missing bullets implied other victims, Jewell immediately drove to check on the woman's family. He was relieved to find the person at the door alive and uninjured, but that person gestured to a television screen where reporters were describing a bloody discovery in the town of Tolleson. Jewell's instincts told him that murders had been committed before the suicide. On the television screen, Jewell saw Tolleson detective Ron Rock at the scene. Jewell picked up the phone and called Rock, a man he'd never met, and said, "You looking for Naomi? 'Cause I've got her." This interaction established a professional bond between the veteran Phoenix detective and the detective from the small jurisdiction of Tolleson, a connection that would prove crucial in the months ahead. On the night of December 29, 2005, Jewell was assigned as the case agent for the shooting of Timmy Tordai at 9th Avenue in Woodland. When Jewell arrived, he found a chaotic scene that included 2 other victims nearby, Marco Carrillo and Jose Ortiz. While other officers viewed the shootings as separate incidents, potentially involving disputes among the homeless population, Jewell immediately suspected a connection. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. As he walked the scene, his instincts told him that Tordai was connected to the 2 dead men. Despite having no forensics or witnesses yet, he believed the 3 shootings were the work of the same entity. Jewell felt strongly that he had a bucket full of cases that were all related, though this theory would be a hard sell to other law enforcement officials who didn't see a pattern connecting the downtown victims to others across the city. A Capitol police officer pointed out a security camera mounted on the 4th level of the Department of Environmental Quality parking garage. The camera overlooked the intersection of 10th Avenue and Adams, positioned right between the locations where the bodies of Marco Carrillo and Jose Ortiz had been found. Jewell secured the footage and studied it obsessively. The grainy black and white video revealed a specific vehicle passing through the intersection 4 times within 10 minutes. Jewell identified it as a silver Toyota Camry with deck-mounted taillights, lights inside the rear window rather than on the bumper, a light over the license plate, dark-tinted windows, and a specific B-pillar design. The car was circling the block, passing through the kill zone repeatedly. The footage provided something else. On the Camry's second pass through the intersection, the camera captured a white cat walking leisurely on the sidewalk. The cat appeared relaxed and confident until the silver Camry passed. Suddenly, the cat jumped straight into the air, changed direction, and darted away at high speed. Jewell concluded that the cat's violent startle response was caused by the sound of a gunshot fired from the Camry, likely the shot that killed Jose Ortiz or Marco Carrillo, or perhaps a shot that missed. The camera angle was too steep for Jewell to read the license plate, but the footage offered one specific biological clue about the killer. The driver's side window was rolled down, and visible on the steering wheel was a white hand steering the vehicle. This confirmed the suspect was likely Caucasian or light-skinned, and the visual of that white hand steering the silver Camry became a central fixation for Jewell as he hunted for the vehicle across the valley. In the early hours of January 11, 2006, Detective Cliff Jewell was working through case files at 1 a.m. when he came across something that caught his attention. The report was sparse, barely detailed, documenting an incident involving a family named Zolcharnik out in Avondale, far to the west. He made a note in the log. On 01-11-06 at about 100 hours, while researching a series of animal and human shootings in the Phoenix area, I came across this report. Jewell tracked down Amy Zolcharnik and spoke with her by phone. She told him about Whiskey, their Akita, who'd been shot 3 times back in July. The wounds were from a .22, and the dog hadn't survived. When Jewell asked about evidence collection, Mrs. Zolcharnik explained that the Phoenix officer who'd responded had reached out to Tolleson PD because they'd been dealing with similar incidents. Ron Rock, the Tolleson detective Jewell had connected with months earlier, had come to the scene and taken 2 shell casings. Jewell contacted Rock and obtained the casings, then submitted them for ballistic analysis through the National Integrated Ballistics Information Network. The results came back positive. The casings recovered from the Zolcharnik yard where Whiskey died matched those found at 9th Avenue and Woodland, where Timmy Tordai had been shot in the neck. The link was no longer theoretical, it was forensic fact. The person shooting animals on the west side and the person shooting people downtown were one and the same. That same day, Jewell made his way to the home of Lieutenant Colonel Ronald Travis, retired, in the Squaw Peak area of East Phoenix. This was where Peyton the dog had died and Martin had been wounded back on December 29th. Jewell asked to look around the backyard, and Travis walked him to the area near the shed where his wife had first discovered the injured animals. Jewell's eyes went to a hole in the shed's back wall. "Has this always been here?" he asked. Travis didn't know. Dark hairs clung to the edges of the hole. Dog hair, Jewell suspected. He asked permission to go inside the shed, explaining he was looking for bullets and black widows. The interior was crammed with storage boxes and family belongings, but Jewell found what he was searching for. A .22 bullet was embedded in the stacked materials, and when Jewell examined it closely, he saw what looked like tissue adhering to the metal. He collected the bullet and sent it to the veterinary school at UC Davis. The analysis confirmed it. The tissue was canine. Over the following weeks, Jewell pushed for the department to go public with what they'd learned. He worked with Sergeant Andy Hill, the public information officer, to coordinate a press conference. On January 27th, Hill brought together representatives from Phoenix, Avondale, and Tolleson, an unusual collaboration necessitated by the sprawling geography of the crimes. The announcement made headlines. For the first time, law enforcement stated publicly that the attacks on animals in the western suburbs and the shootings of people downtown were connected. The department had 2 objectives in going public: generate tips from anyone who might have information, and warn residents to take precautions. The West Valley View ran a story about what they termed an equestrian crime spree, but the article mistakenly suggested the attacks had ended back in July 2005. The violence hadn't stopped at all. The news hit Phoenix hard. Residents were baffled and frightened, struggling to understand how someone could target both animals and people seemingly at random. The confusion was compounded by concurrent reporting about the Baseline Rapist, a different serial offender operating in a different part of the city with different victims. The 2 cases had nothing to do with each other, but the simultaneous coverage created chaos in the public consciousness. Still, the phrase serial killer cut through the noise and got people's attention. Just over a month later, at 1:30 on the morning of March 7th, Tim Boviel was cycling eastbound along Camelback Road near an apartment complex entrance when he noticed a small sedan in the curb lane. He heard what sounded like a car backfiring, then felt a sharp pain in his lower body. When he reached back and felt moisture, he looked at his hand and saw blood. He was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital, where surgeons discovered the bullet had torn through his rectum. Emergency surgery was performed, and Boviel was fitted with a colostomy bag. Within days, Jewell learned about the Boviel assault from Commander Lewis's office. He went to St. Joseph's to interview the victim and learned the bullet remained lodged inside Boviel's body. Doctors had no plans to extract it. Jewell tried to gauge the caliber by studying a CAT scan with help from an anesthesiologist, but the imaging was inconclusive. He left his card with the hospital staff and asked them to contact him if the bullet was ever removed. While Jewell was investigating the Boviel shooting, other violent incidents were unfolding across Phoenix. 2 employees of Yoshi's restaurant, Liliana Sanchez Cabrera and Chow Zhou, were found dead at a residence on North 24th Street, both shot in the head. Around the same time, a businessman spotted blood streaks across gravel in a parking lot on the same street. Police searched but found nothing initially. When the businessman returned a week later to investigate a terrible smell, he discovered a body in decomposition. The victim was Kristen Nicole Gibbons, also shot in the head. Another murder victim, Sophia Nunez, was found dead as well. On April 14th, Raymond McQueen had an encounter in a convenience store. He accidentally bumped into another man who apologized politely. Outside, McQueen approached the man and asked if he could spare some change. The man acted as though he was reaching for his wallet, then pivoted suddenly and drove a jackknife into McQueen's abdomen. Before McQueen could react, the attacker was in a waiting vehicle with 2 other occupants, and they sped away. McQueen was left bleeding in the parking lot, having lost roughly a gallon of blood by the time help arrived, but he survived. That spring, the television program America's Most Wanted reached out to Detective Cliff Jewell about featuring the case. Jewell agreed, hoping national exposure might generate leads. He flew to the show's Maryland studios for a live broadcast scheduled for April 15th. Before the taping, Jewell had been explicit with the producers about one thing in particular. They were not to show a .22 caliber rifle on screen. His reasoning was tactical. If the killer saw law enforcement had identified the weapon type, he might switch calibers to throw off the ballistic trail. Jewell made this point clear multiple times. Sitting in the studio as the show aired, Jewell watched in disbelief as a .22 caliber rifle appeared on screen. His immediate thought, as he would later recount, was, "Oh no, now he's going to change guns, he's going to change caliber." It was a mistake he would carry with him. 4 days later, on April 19th, America's Most Wanted host John Walsh appeared on Larry King Live and discussed what he called the mysterious shootings in Phoenix. Walsh offered what he presented as insider information. The shooter might be using what he termed a bizarre survival gun, a weapon that could fire both shotgun shells and .22 rounds. Walsh described it as very unique. Jewell found himself in the uncomfortable position of calling television producers to demand they stop discussing weapon specifics. He needed people looking for the right person, he explained, not fixating on hardware details that might not even be accurate. Less than 2 weeks later, on May 2nd, the violence resumed. Claudia Gutierrez Cruz worked her day shift at Inza Coffee, then was called in to cover the evening shift at Barcelona Restaurant. She clocked out at 7:44 that evening and caught a southbound bus on Scottsdale Road at 8:05. Shortly before 10 that night, 17-year-old Kibili Tambadou was walking north on 44th Street near Van Buren when he was hit by shotgun fire. At 10:04, police received a 911 call from the Hotel Radisson where Tambadou had run for help, bleeding from his wounds. Between that call and 10:30, Claudia was walking down Thomas Road when a shotgun fired from the passenger window of a Toyota Camry at close range, later estimated at about 6 feet. Daniel Brown was driving home when he saw a car swerve ahead of him. He discovered Claudia crawling into the street and called 911. In the background of his call, Claudia could be heard screaming. Paramedics transported her to the hospital with catastrophic abdominal injuries. After midnight, she died. Detective Pete Salazar went to notify her sister Adriana. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. The next morning, May 3rd, Jewell heard a news report about the Thomas Road murder. The victim had been killed with a shotgun, not the .22 he'd been tracking, but Jewell's instincts told him this was connected. The weapon change matched exactly what he'd feared after the America's Most Wanted broadcast. He told his supervisor he needed to meet with Scottsdale because this was one of his cases. On Thursday morning, May 4th, 4 detectives gathered for a meeting. Jewell came from Phoenix with his files on the downtown murders and animal shootings. Ron Rock brought his cases from Tolleson, including David Estrada's murder and the livestock attacks. Pete Salazar and Hugh Lockerbie represented Scottsdale, carrying the fresh Gutierrez Cruz homicide file. They spread out their cases and looked for patterns in what seemed like chaos. The work involved comparing 3 distinct categories of violence that most agencies were treating as separate phenomena. The shotgun attacks included Gutierrez Cruz, but Jewell also brought the case of Clarissa Rowley, shot with a shotgun on Van Buren back on December 29th, along with Cherokee, a dog killed with a shotgun that same night. His argument was straightforward. If Clarissa and Cherokee were shot on the same night as his 22 victims, the perpetrator had to be switching weapons. The shooting of Timmy Tordai, who survived, and the downtown deaths of Marco Carrillo and Jose Ortiz. The animal shootings spanned the valley: Apache and Sarah Moon in Tolleson, Buddy the Burro, Whiskey in Avondale, and the Phoenix area dogs, Peyton, Martin, Peanut, Irving, and Shep. As they compared notes, certain facts became undeniable. Salazar and Lockerbie had found no enemies in Claudia Gutierrez Cruz's life. She was simply a hard-working woman walking home from her job. Rock had spent a year chasing leads on David Estrada with nothing to show for it. The animal shootings defied explanation through typical motives like neighbor disputes or property conflicts. The 4 detectives reached a conclusion. These attacks were random yet connected. They were dealing with a serial killer who shot for sport, targeting both animals and people across the metropolitan area without discernible pattern or motive. What they didn't know at the time was that Kabili Tambadou, shot the same night as Claudia, was in a hospital just miles away. His case hadn't been linked yet. The group decided their next step should be requesting a profile from the FBI. On Friday, May 5th, Jewell placed the call to Quantico. When FBI profilers arrived 3 days later on May 8th, they rejected the local detectives' theory entirely. The profilers stated that a serial killer does not change weapons in mid-series, and they insisted the .22 shooter and the shotgun shooter were 2 different individuals acting independently. Jewell, Rock, Salazar, and Lockerbie disagreed. The evidence from December 29th alone showed both weapon types used in a single night of coordinated attacks. They remained convinced they were hunting a single entity, likely 2 men working together who switched between rifles and shotguns. After the FBI meeting concluded, the 4 detectives continued meeting on their own, maintaining their working theory. That same day, May 5th, brought another development. The Phoenix Police Department held a press conference announcing a dramatic escalation in another case. The offender, previously known as the Baseline Rapist, who'd been targeting women and girls along Baseline Road in South Phoenix, was now being called the Baseline Killer. Police publicly linked 18 specific crimes to this suspect: sexual assaults on victims as young as 12, armed robberies, and execution-style murders where victims were typically shot in the head. The attacks had occurred between August 2005 and May 2006, and several were high-profile homicides, including the September murder of Georgia Thompson, the December killing of Tina Washington, and the March double homicide of restaurant employees Liliana Sanchez Cabrera and Chowjo. By early August, the number of attributed crimes would rise to 23. The timing created a perfect storm. Phoenix was dealing with 2 active serial killers simultaneously, and the Baseline investigation, with its DNA and ballistic evidence tying together rapes and murders, absorbed most of the Homicide Division's resources. When a task force was eventually formed for the serial shooter case, it ended up being led by the assault unit under Detective Clark Schwarzkopf rather than homicide. This structural decision forced Jewell to fight for inclusion to ensure the .22 caliber murders weren't overlooked. The public panic was substantial. Community meetings overflowed, and Clear Channel Outdoor launched a massive billboard campaign aimed at catching what they called the serial killers, plural. On May 17th, Timothy Davenport was crossing a dark parking lot when a silver car pulled up. A man got out and approached from behind, stabbing Davenport in the shoulder and ribs. The driver then pulled alongside Davenport and asked if he was okay while the assailant slashed his face. Davenport managed to run to a friend's house and was air evacuated to a hospital where he survived with a punctured lung. 13 days later, on May 30th, James Hodge stepped out of his apartment at 89th Avenue in Camelback at 11 that night to smoke a cigarette. The 56-year-old Vietnam veteran watched as a car executed a U-turn, pulled up beside him, and fired a 12-gauge shotgun. On June 8th, Paul Patrick was having a frustrating day. The 45-year-old grocery warehouse worker had watched his beloved Arizona Diamondbacks lose to the Mets 7-1, and now he was out of cigarettes with money tight. At 8:53 that evening, security cameras at the Walmart on 95th Avenue captured two men arriving in what appeared to be a light silver Toyota Camry. The larger man wore a rugby shirt, the smaller wore yellow. They entered the store, placed bedding in a cart, and walked to the domestic section. At 9:30, a fire erupted in the silk houseplants department of the Walmart Supercenter at Camelback and 95th. Smoke filled the building, sprinklers activated, and 120 people evacuated. Surveillance footage would later show the two suspects leaving the area 60 seconds before smoke appeared. 45 minutes later, at 10:15, a second fire broke out at another Walmart 8 miles away on Northern Avenue, again starting in the silk houseplants section. 75 people fled. Security footage would confirm that the same two men were the only people present at both fire origin sites. Glendale fire investigator Mike Blair arrived at the first Walmart at 10:25. Around 11 that night, Paul Patrick decided he couldn't wait any longer for cigarettes. Despite his fear of what the media was calling the serial shooter, he walked toward the gas station and crossed Indian School Road. He felt a major impact in his right trunk and looked down to see his entrails exposed. He was still standing because he'd walked into the shot rather than being knocked backward. He yelled for help. Saul Guerrero, a 22-year-old Army medic who lived across the street, ran to Paul carrying a .45 pistol for protection and a first aid kit. He lowered Paul to the ground to prevent him from fainting and stayed with him until paramedics arrived. Paul was transported to St. Joseph's Hospital with massive injuries from a 12-gauge shotgun blast and placed in an induced coma. Phoenix woke on June 9th to news of two Walmarts set ablaze and a man shot on the street. 2 days later, on June 11th, Elizabeth Clark was shot with a .410 shotgun while riding her bike in a West Side neighborhood. She survived. 9 days after that, in the early morning hours of June 20th around 3, Frederick Senna was painting a sign at A1 Liquor on Indian School Road. The 57-year-old noticed a small blue vehicle pass him twice. He turned his back to the road and was hit by .410 shotgun fire. He staggered 2 blocks to the VA hospital. That same night, Tony Long was shot with a .410 shotgun on the southeast corner of 44th Street in Van Buren, the same intersection where Kabili Tambadu had been shot in May. Long ran to a Circle K for help. Later that afternoon at 3 o'clock, on a humid day with temperatures reaching 105 degrees, a woman named Joetta Gonzalez arrived at the Glendale police station. Joetta worked as a barmaid at taverns in northwest Phoenix, and her ex-husband had called to tell her she should watch the news about the Walmart arsons, asking if the man in the surveillance footage looked like her friend from the bar. Joetta sat down with Glendale fire investigator Mike Blair and ATF agent Kevin Schuster. When they slid surveillance photos across the table, she confirmed the identity of the larger man immediately. She pointed to a tattoo on his right forearm and told the investigators, "That tattoo, that's definitely him." She identified the design as a skull logo from the punk band The Misfits. The man's name was Sammy, she explained. Samuel John Dietman. He was an electrician from Minnesota who'd previously worked at Honeywell. He typically wore dark t-shirts, sometimes featuring swastikas. She described him as a major alcoholic who used drugs and frequented specific bars including the Stardust Inn, the Amber Inn, and the Rib Shop. Crucially, she noted that Sammy didn't own a car and relied on others for transportation. While Blair and Schuster were focused on the arson cases, Joetta mentioned something else. The last time she'd seen Sammy, about a month earlier, he'd been crying. He asked if she'd heard about a man shot on a bicycle on Camelback Road, then confessed that he'd been out with another man and they'd shot the bicyclist with a shotgun. Sammy claimed the other man had told him to do it. At the time, Joetta had dismissed it as drunken rambling, but she passed the information along now. When the agents showed her surveillance video of the suspects arriving at Walmart in a light silver Toyota Camry, Joetta didn't recognize the vehicle. She repeated that Sammy didn't have a car, which meant the Camry belonged to the second man in the footage. Based on Joetta's information, investigators obtained authorization to trace Sam Dietman's cell phone and set up surveillance at the bars she'd mentioned. ATF agent Schuster followed protocol and notified the Phoenix Police Department that their arson suspect might be connected to shootings. On July 1st, at 1:23 in the morning, Diana Bain was shot with a .410 shotgun while walking on Van Buren to buy cigarettes. The 47-year-old ran to a motel manager for help. Around 1:50, Jeremy Ortiz, 24, was shot with a .410 shotgun on 16th Street and made it to a Circle K on McDowell Road. In the early morning hours of July 2nd or 3rd, around 3, Joseph Roberts was walking his bicycle near 26th Street and Indian School when a silver sedan slowed down with its headlights off. A long barrel emerged from the window. Roberts was shot, and surgeons would later remove a third of his stomach. On July 7th, David Perez was talking on his cell phone in front of his house in North Phoenix when a passing car fired a shotgun, hitting him in the neck and destroying his phone. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. Late that night, 27-year-old Ashley Armenta and her husband Javier argued after a night out. She demanded to be let out of the car at 48th Street and Indian School so she could walk to her in-laws' house. In the early morning hours of July 8th, Ashley walked north on 44th Street. She noticed a light silver Toyota Camry, approximately a 2000 model, hovering at a stop sign on Devonshire. At 2:38, she called her husband. Seconds later, she was shot in the head and back with a .410 shotgun. The Camry drove away slowly. Her husband found her moments later and rushed her to the emergency room. 2 minutes after Ashley was shot, at 2:40, Gary Begay was walking home from work on Van Buren near Honey Bear's Barbecue when a car slowed down. The 31-year-old saw a pale face and a flash, then felt the impact of .410 shotgun pellets. That same day, Detective Cliff Jewell was driving home after spending the week teaching a homicide investigation course for the Arizona Homicide Investigators Board. On his car radio, he heard a news report announcing that a task force had been formed to catch the serial shooter. Jewell was stunned. He'd been investigating the linked .22 caliber shootings since January and had already established a working group with detectives from Scottsdale and Tolleson back in May. Yet the official department task force had been created without his knowledge or participation. Jewell immediately called Detective Clark Schwarzkopf, a veteran of the assault unit who'd been assigned as lead case agent for the serial shooter because recent victims like Paul Patrick and James Hodge had survived their shotgun wounds. Jewell asked if he had a task force he should be attending. A fundamental disagreement existed between the two detectives. Schwarzkopf was focused on the shotgun attacks occurring on the west side. When Jewell presented his cases, Schwarzkopf was skeptical because the ballistics didn't match. He asked if Jewell's cases were .22s and concluded he didn't see the connection. Jewell insisted that his collection of unsolved .22 caliber homicides and animal shootings were committed by the same entity responsible for the shotgun attacks. He argued the crimes were random, meaning there was no apparent reason any particular victim had been targeted. Jewell tried to convince Schwarzkopf by presenting the evidence he'd built over 6 months. On December 29, 2005, he pointed out the killer had used both weapons in a single night. The men downtown were shot with a .22, while the dog Cherokee and the prostitute Clarissa Rowley were shot with a shotgun. He insisted the shootings of horses in Tolleson and dogs across Phoenix were connected to the human attacks, either as practice or sport by the same perpetrator. Schwarzkopf remained focused on the shotgun assaults, but Jewell refused to be excluded. He officially had the .22 cases reassigned to himself to ensure they remained active. Although not initially invited to the task force, Jewell began showing up at police headquarters during his off hours. He sat with the task force, sorted through tips, and kept his .22 caliber files on the table, determined that when suspects were finally caught, the evidence from the rifle shootings would be ready to link them to the murders. Just after midnight on July 11th, Michael Cordry decided to go for a run. The divorce attorney was blonde, prosperous, and recently back from a 2-week vacation where he felt he'd overindulged. He'd waited until after midnight for the temperature to drop to what he considered a passingly reasonable 95 degrees. The neighborhood was quiet and meticulously maintained, and Cordry was the only person on the street. About half a mile into his jog, Cordry noticed light behind him from a vehicle, then watched as the light vanished when the driver cut the headlights. He turned to see a 4-door car slowing near him with the passenger window rolled down. The interior was pitch black, eerily so, and the sight gave him a cold feeling. A loud boom and bright flash disoriented him. Cordry realized the car was moving away very slowly. Fearing the shooter might return, he took cover behind a van parked in a nearby driveway, ready to vault fences if necessary. From his hiding spot, he watched the vehicle turn south at the end of the road and noted it had deck-mounted taillights. Unsure whether he'd experienced a prank or an actual attack, Cordry returned to the scene the next morning. He discovered a cluster of sooty black dents the size of a fist in the cinder block wall directly behind where he'd been standing. The impact was at chest level. Looking at those marks, he understood they were trying to kill him. On the night of the shooting, he'd found the shotgun wadding on the ground. Cordry placed the wadding in a bag and drove it to the Glendale police station. Like Isaac Crudup, whose dog Shep had been killed months earlier, Cordry found no one available to receive the evidence and left frustrated. He told a senior partner at his law firm about the incident, and the partner called Glendale police, prompting them into action. Detective Cliff Jewell heard about the shooting and drove to Glendale to personally take custody of the wadding. He identified it as coming from a 12-gauge shotgun, confirming the killer was using 3 different types of weapons: a .22 rifle, a .410 shotgun, and now a heavy-duty 12-gauge, the same caliber used to shoot Paul Patrick on June 8th. 5 days later, on July 16th, an anonymous caller contacted the silent witness tip line and told the operator he didn't want to leave his name. He said he thought his friend Sammy might be involved in the serial shooter crimes, then hastily hung up. Tip line operators turned the call over to detectives, but without a name or contact information, there was nowhere to take the lead. 12 days after that, on July 28th, the same man called the tip line again. He asked the operator if he could truly remain anonymous. After receiving assurances that the information would only go to detectives, he provided his full name, Ron Horton. He told the operator that the girl killed on Scottsdale Road, Claudia Gutierrez Cruz, might have been killed with a .410 gauge shotgun. His friend Sammy had told him they used that weapon because birdshot couldn't be traced like a bullet could. When the operator asked for contact information, Ron provided his phone number, worried it might destroy his anonymity, but compelled by thoughts of the victim's suffering. The mention of a .410 shotgun flagged the tip as critical because that detail hadn't been released to the media. The information was forwarded to detectives Clark Schwarzkopf and Daryl Smith. A detective called Scottsdale Detective Pete Salazar to verify details about the Gutierrez Cruz murder. Was she near a street lamp, and was she wearing clothes that could be mistaken for a man's? The answers were no to the first question and yes to the second. She'd been wearing pants and a shapeless jacket. Detective Smith then contacted the ATF to cross-reference Ron Horton's information with their file on the Walmart arson suspect. The ATF and Glendale Fire were already searching for a suspect named Sammy, based on an earlier identification by a barmaid named Joetta Gonzalez. Smith asked if their suspect was named Sammy and hung out in bars, specifically the Stardust Inn and the Rib Shop. The ATF confirmed these were the establishments their suspect frequented. Most importantly, Smith asked if their suspect had been heard blubbering about shooting people with a shotgun. The ATF confirmed this detail, which had come from Joetta's earlier statement that Sam had been crying and confessing to shooting a bicyclist. Later that day, Ron Horton received a callback from detectives and arranged care for his sons. The meeting took place at a Mexican restaurant chosen specifically because it was far from the biker circuit Ron frequented, ensuring that neither Sam Dietman nor any of Ron's biker friends would spot him talking to police. Ron Horton was a construction worker and friend of Sam Dietman. He'd been watching the news about the serial shooter and connected the reports to strange comments Sam had made earlier in the spring about RVing, random recreational violence, and shooting people with a shotgun because it couldn't be traced. Sam had also cried about killing a woman he thought was a man. When detectives handed Ron the file containing the still photo from the Walmart security video, his reaction was immediate. He looked at the image and said, it was definitely Sam. This identification was crucial because although Detective Schwarzkopf already had Sam's name in his files, a typo listed it as Dietima Samuel, missing the letter N. Computer searches had failed to link the misspelled name to Sam's criminal record or to the Sammy mentioned by Ron. Ron didn't know the name of the second man in the photo, but he recognized him from a specific incident. He identified the man as the weird guy who'd come to the rib shop one night in the spring to pick Sam up. That night, Sam had been angry about a dispute with his roommate's girlfriend. After leaving with this man, Sam had sent Ron a text message stating that someone was going to get hurt. By connecting the man in the Walmart arson photo to the night Sam threatened violence, Ron provided a link between the property crimes and potential for physical violence. The detectives showed Ron a photo of a silver Camry, the vehicle investigators had been obsessing over. Ron stated he'd never seen it before and reiterated that Sammy didn't have a car. Sam relied on others for transportation, which aligned with the fact that the other man was the one driving the vehicle. Detectives Schwarzkopf and Smith needed to locate Sam Dietman physically. They urged Ron to phone Sam and arrange a social meeting to flush him out. Ron didn't act immediately. He was conflicted about betraying a friend and had a lot to think about. Eventually, though, he started texting Sam. On the evening of July 30th, 22-year-old Robin Blasnek had been to dinner at the Olive Garden with friends before returning to her parents' home in Mesa. She said goodnight to her parents and went to her bedroom. 30 miles away in the Northwest Valley, Ron Horton waited anxiously for contact from Sam Dietman, agonizing over Sam's previous comments about killing people. Sam and his accomplice were driving the silver Camry, having just returned from Las Vegas, where they'd gone to let the heat die down after news reports mentioned a suspect vehicle in the serial shooter case. At 10:51, Robin received a text message from someone she considered a special friend. The message read, "Come over." Robin texted back asking when, and the friend replied, "Now." Around 11 that night, with her parents asleep, Robin prepared to sneak out. Worried about waking them, she didn't put on shoes but wore fuzzy blue slippers along with sweatpants and a pink spaghetti strap tank top. She had bracelets, toe rings, and anklets on. She slipped out the back door of the house on the quiet residential cul-de-sac, walked down the block to a larger street, turned south, then east onto a major thoroughfare. Around this time, Ron Horton's phone chirped with a text from Sam confirming he'd been in Vegas. Ron texted back asking if he'd won or lost, then waited for a reply. As Robin walked, she was active on her cell phone, speaking with her ex-boyfriend Tremaine and coyly refusing to tell him whose house she was going to. She also took calls from girlfriends. Ron received a reply from Sam saying he'd lost, and sent another text trying to keep the conversation going, but got slow, one-word responses. Robin turned south onto Gilbert Road, a main artery in the East Valley. Sam and his accomplice turned onto Gilbert Road in the silver Camry and spotted her walking. They stalked her for several blocks, having to turn away multiple times to avoid being seen by other cars. A homeowner named Frank Bonfiglio drove past Robin and noticed the thin white female walking alone, wondering what she was doing out. His presence forced the Camry to circle back. Minutes later, Bonfiglio pulled into his garage and opened a beer in his backyard. Robin was nearing the end of the block, close to her destination, looking for the number of her friend Robbie in her contact list. The silver Camry approached heading north while Robin walked south. The driver pulled the car into the opposite lane to get closer to her and fired a .410 shotgun through the driver's side window. Bonfiglio heard a loud bang from his backyard. Down the street, the Chase family was watching a movie and heard a pop. Members of the Chase family ran outside, and Mr. Chase saw a figure kneeling in the darkness. He approached and asked if she was okay. Robin was holding her cell phone, trying to use it. She told Mr. Chase, "I've been shot." Blood was everywhere, ranging from her chest to her feet. Chase shouted instructions to his family while his daughter called 911 and his wife and sons brought towels and blankets. The neighbors attempted to stop the bleeding and placed blankets under Robin to protect her from the scalding pavement, still hot from the day's temperatures exceeding 100 degrees. Mr. Chase cradled her in his arms. She lost consciousness. Receiving no further engagement from Sam, Ron sent a final text saying Sam was obviously busy and to call when he was free. He gave up for the night, telling a friend on the phone that Sam was up to something. Police and paramedics arrived within minutes, taped off the scene, and began a massive canvass. They interviewed Frank Bonfiglio and ruled him out. Robin Blasnek was pronounced dead early the next morning. She'd been shot in the torso. Early Monday morning, Ron received a call informing him that a 22-year-old girl had been shot while walking in Mesa at 11 the previous night. He realized this had occurred while he was texting Sam. He felt responsible, believing that if he'd kept Sam engaged or contacted police sooner, he might have saved her. This became the catalyst for him to aggressively help the task force set a trap for the killers. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. Two days later, on the evening of August 1st, Phoenix Police Sergeant Don Sherrod was stationed in the parking lot of a strip mall at 43rd Avenue and Olive when he watched a silver Toyota Camry enter. Sam Dietman exited the vehicle, and Sherrod recognized him from the Walmart surveillance photos. The driver, a smaller man, stayed in the car. The silver Camry left the lot with Sergeant Sherrod following, while other undercover units stayed with Dietman. Sam entered the Stardust Inn to meet Ron Horton while it was still daylight outside. He ordered a rum and coke. The bar was populated with regulars and several undercover officers drinking water. A news report about the serial shooter came on the television above the bar. Sam watched intensely, stood up, and placed his hands behind his back, miming being handcuffed. He told Ron, "They can't pin the shooting of the mental bitch on me. I used a small caliber shotgun on her," referencing Robin Blasnek's murder 2 days earlier. He also claimed police were too stupid to catch them. Ron, nervous that the undercover officers were too obvious, called Detective Daryl Smith from the bathroom, asking them to back off. Some officers left the bar. Sergeant Sherrod followed the Camry to the Metro Center Mall, where the driver parked and entered. While he was inside, police surreptitiously placed a GPS tracker on the silver Camry. The driver returned with mundane purchases, and Sherrod followed as he drove south on I-17. The Camry exited in downtown Phoenix and drove down Van Buren, then turned onto Adams Street and drove specifically past the backside of Phoenix Police Headquarters. Officers listening on the radio interpreted this loop as a taunt. He then drove miles to the East Valley and parked at an apartment complex in Mesa at 550 East McKellips, disappearing behind a door. Late that night, Sam and Ron left the Stardust Inn in Ron's white Ford pickup truck. Ron drove Sam to the Wild Horse Pass Casino, terrified that he was alone in a truck with a serial killer. He had a .38 caliber gun under the seat. At the casino, Ron called Detective Smith again, saying he wanted to leave. He was instructed not to drive Sam home so police could watch the other suspect pick him up. Ron told Sam he was too tired to drive him to Mesa. Sam said it was no problem because Dale was coming to get him. This was the first time his accomplice was named. Ron left. Police tentatively identified the accomplice as Dale S. Hausner via the license plate of the silver Camry. In the early morning hours of August 2nd, around 2, Sam exited the casino. Dale Hausner had arrived in the silver Camry, and they coordinated via text to find each other in the massive parking lot. When they met at the car, Dale opened the trunk and pulled out a black duffel bag containing an object about 2.5 feet long. Undercover officers watched as Dale stroked or petted the object through the canvas. Sam took the bag and placed it in the right rear passenger seat within easy reach. The Camry left the casino but didn't return to the Mesa apartment. Instead, they drove aimlessly through Mesa, Chandler, and Gilbert. The vehicle slowed down near pedestrians and bicyclists, made U-turns to pass people twice, and entered residential neighborhoods. Sergeant Sherrard described the behavior as hunting. Detective Brian Benson, believing a shooting was imminent, put on his protective vest. When the Camry pulled up to a female pedestrian at 8th and Main, Benson waited for them to drive away, then yelled at the woman to run. In a dark area with no other cars, the pair spotted 2 children on a bicycle. Dale handed the shotgun to Sam, who placed it on the windowsill but hesitated, thinking he couldn't shoot 2 kids on a bike. Sam lied to Dale, claiming he saw a police helicopter, which was actually present. Dale called him paranoid but drove off. The Camry entered a parking lot where surveillance cars couldn't follow, and the air unit buzzed the lot to disrupt them. The Camry returned to the Windscape Apartments in Mesa, apartment 1083. Sam carried the black bag inside. Detective Travis Bird, hiding in the bushes near the walkway, overheard the men say that rain had ruined the night. Later that day, Sam walked out of the apartment with a black plastic garbage bag and threw it in the dumpster. Once Sam returned inside, Detective Bird climbed into the dumpster and retrieved the bag. He drove the trash to headquarters, where detectives found a map of the Phoenix metro area with red and blue dots marking the locations of the serial shooter crimes, along with a cherry vanilla Dr. Pepper can that contained a spent .410 gauge shotgun shell. This evidence confirmed the identity of the killers. In the late afternoon, surveillance teams observed Dale Hausner leave the apartment and drive to a health clinic. He returned carrying a small child, his daughter Amanda. The presence of the toddler forced the SWAT team to stand down because they couldn't raid the apartment with a child in the line of fire. Instead of a takedown, police focused on installing listening devices in the Camry and in the wall of the adjacent apartment. On this same date, the number of crimes officially attributed to the separate Baseline killer investigation rose to 23. On Thursday, August 3rd, murder charges were officially dropped against James Duane Mullins in the Baseline killer investigation. Mullins had previously provided a false confession regarding the murder of Georgia Thompson, but authorities determined he hadn't been in Arizona at the time and that his false claims had caused a significant diversion of resources during the hunt for the genuine killer. At Phoenix Police Headquarters that day, the activity was fast, furious, and feverish. Detectives, including Scottsdale's Pete Salazar, typed frantically to prepare affidavits for search warrants and wiretaps, working to ensure the evidence would withstand legal scrutiny. The Windscape Apartments in Mesa were under heavy surveillance, with officers monitoring apartment 1083, where Dale Hausner, Sam Dietman, and Hausner's toddler daughter, Amanda, were located. An electronics crew installed a microphone in the rear deck of the silver Camry, where a third taillight had been removed, and knocked on the door of the adjacent apartment to install another microphone in the drywall of the common wall. That evening, detectives listened in real time as Hausner and Dietman watched television news reports about their own crimes and retrospectives on other serial killers. Dale Hausner adopted a play-acting voice and asked Dietman, "Really? We're being copycatted, Sam? We're pioneers, Sam. We're leading the way for a better life for everyone, Sam." The conversation revealed their obsession with their status relative to other famous killers. Dietman compared their operation unfavorably to the DC snipers, commenting that they were more experienced with more technology and know-how. The pair viewed themselves as rivals to the Baseline killer, with Hausner believing they'd outdone him. Hausner kept a scrapbook of clippings about the Baseline killer and knew the suspect's description by heart: a black male with a wig. The men became indignant when the news media underreported their crimes. When a report stated that police had linked 6 shootings to the serial shooter, Hausner complained, "The death toll is higher than that. What about that fucking guy I shot at 27th Avenue in the yard?" Later, when a news program claimed the serial shooter had killed 27 people, Dietman interrupted to claim, 27? We killed 35. He added that he intended to kill 500 people before he was through. The detectives listening were struck by the hilarity in the men's voices as they discussed these atrocities. Hausner declared he loved shooting people in the back, referencing James Hodge. Dietman described his preference for shooting victims who were walking away to give him time to aim, admitting he got paranoid when victims walked toward the car because they might see the gun. Hausner mocked the death of Robin Blasnek, imitating her crying and making a pun on her name, calling her Blastnek while hooting with laughter. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect occurred when Hausner involved his toddler daughter in the conversation. He urged the child to say goodnight to Sam, then instructed her to say, "Don't kill anybody." The men laughed as they taught the toddler to add the qualifier "in the morning," joking that it was too early to kill in the morning. This conversation provided the moment law enforcement needed: the confirmation of their identities, the presence of the child in a home where murder was a game, and the explicit confession to specific unpublicized crimes triggered preparations for that night's takedown. However, the tactical situation was complicated by the toddler's presence. The assembled SWAT team felt that a raid was inappropriate while the baby was inside, not knowing if the suspects would use the child as a hostage or if she would be harmed during a breach. Command decided no arrest would be made until they could figure out the situation with the baby. At headquarters, the support team had been working at a frantic pace to prepare the necessary legal paperwork. Detective Pete Salazar was in a state of extreme fatigue beyond exhaustion after working non-stop since the suspects were identified. Once the decision was made regarding the child's safety, officers providing support services were told there would be no takedown that night and were ordered to go home and get some sleep. Salazar drove home and fell into a deep sleep next to his wife. Just before midnight, the door to Unit 1083 opened. Sam Dietman emerged carrying a trash bag, his skull tattoo clearly visible on his right arm. He stepped off the concrete walkway onto the black asphalt of the parking lot. The air was sultry, with temperatures still over 90 degrees despite the late hour. Unaware of the surveillance surrounding him, Dietman walked toward the dumpster, swung the trash bag up and over the rim, then turned back toward the apartment. The command was issued, and a SWAT team materialized out of the darkness. Dietman was tackled instantly, forced down onto the hot asphalt with officers' knees pressed into his back. He was handcuffed with his hands behind him, the same position he'd mimed in jest while watching news reports at the Stardust Inn days earlier. Samuel John Dietman was taken into custody. A loud bang signaled the breach as SWAT officers crashed through the front door of the apartment, bright tactical lights shining into the living space. Inside, Dale Hausner had been puttering about with newspapers and felt pens, scrolling through articles and cutting out column inches. He'd begun to wonder what was taking Sam so long to return from the trash run. When the door crashed open and lights shined in, Hausner stood confused. He couldn't see the figures behind the bright lights, and initially thought it was a practical joke played by Sam. The shouting of the officers quickly corrected his assumption. Hausner was forced face down onto the hard floor, his hands yanked together and handcuffed behind his back, with officers pressing their knees into his back. He was wearing only gym shorts. Hausner didn't appear upset, but adopted an attitude of friendliness. With a smile on his whisker-covered face, he kept his voice soft and cheerful, and immediately began telling officers about his little daughter in the other room. Neighbor Cindy McGillivray heard the commotion in the middle of the night and stuck her head out to see the swarm of law enforcement personnel centering on Dale's apartment. Worried about the sick child inside, she hurried outside and approached a SWAT team member, telling him they needed to know there was a little girl inside who wasn't well. The officer informed her the child was fine and had already been delivered to her mother, Linda Swaney. Cindy was astonished by this news because Dale had led her to believe he was the sole parent and that there was nobody else. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. "15 minutes after falling asleep, Salazar's phone rang. He was told the takedown was underway and to come back. Nearly disoriented with fatigue, he rushed back to the command station. Following the SWAT entry, law enforcement officers scoured the apartment and discovered a jumbled arsenal, often within reach of the toddler. They found a shotgun sawed off at the butt lying on the floor, a 12-gauge shotgun leaning against the door, and more than a dozen other guns stored behind the couch and on the bedroom floor. Fanny packs, Tupperware bowls, and beer boxes were filled with live ammunition. The search revealed ice picks, awls, and buck knives, along with fistfuls of plastic cigarette lighters stored in bowls, bags, and wooden boxes. Small bags of crystal meth sat on the television in plain sight with a glass pipe in the kitchen. On the coffee table, police found books titled Stupid Criminals and Getting Even, along with a satanic Bible. In the kitchen, investigators discovered a handwritten note scrawled in black ink on the back of a flyer for a boxing event. It read, "He who asks about the $5 bill is a homicidal maniac, thief, arsonist, destroyer of property, drug-taking god among mortals." Linda Swaney cooperated with police immediately that night, turning over everything Dale had ever left at her house and changing her locks. In the early morning hours, the heads of the involved agencies and the mayor gathered in the great atrium of Phoenix City Hall. The entire nation tuned in via major networks. Mayor Phil Gordon declared that these were the monsters they'd been hunting, that they'd turned the tables on them, and the reign of terror was over. Assistant Phoenix Police Chief Kevin Robinson stated they knew they had the individuals involved, and when reporters asked for details, he claimed interviews were still in process, though they hadn't yet begun. Assistant Chief Bill Lewis added that he could assure everyone these were the right guys and the hunt was over, but the work had just begun. The silver Toyota Camry was transported to the Mesa Police Department evidence bay, following strict chain-of-custody protocols. Scottsdale Detective Hugh Lockerbie donned booties and gloves to examine the vehicle and opened the right rear passenger door. He found a .22 caliber shell casing inside the car and immediately called Phoenix Detective Cliff Jewell. "Guess what I just found? In the Camry." This discovery provided the physical link Jewell needed to connect the suspects not just to the shotgun crimes, but to the series of .22 caliber shootings he'd been tracking since December 2005. Task Force lead Clark Schwarzkopf decided Jewell wouldn't conduct the interviews. Jewell watched the interrogations from a monitor in another room, occasionally entering only to adjust cameras or bring coffee. Following his arrest, Dale Hausner presented himself to Detective Schwarzkopf not as a monster, but as a helpful, cheerful citizen. He waived his rights, offered his height and weight before being asked, and projected an attitude of friendliness. When Schwarzkopf asked if he followed the news, Hausner immediately brought up the Baseline Rapist and the serial killer. Hausner's response went far beyond casual awareness. He recited the suspect's description from police flyers with precision, noting authorities were looking for a light-skinned black male, 25 to 30 years old, 5'10" to 6 feet tall, 170 pounds, who wore a wig disguise. He admitted he clipped these articles and kept them in scrapbooks at his house, along with coverage of his own alleged crimes. To explain this collection, Hausner attempted to construct a persona of a fascinated observer. He tried to bond with the detective over a shared intellectual interest in the macabre, citing movies and referencing Charles Starkweather, Jeffrey Dahmer, and the BTK killer, questioning aloud what makes a person click over to be a maniac. By framing himself as a student of criminal psychology, he attempted to distance himself from the actual acts of violence. Detectives Darren Oud and Pete Salazar joined the interrogation to break through this facade by weaponizing Hausner's narcissism and his rivalry with the Baseline killer. They'd listened to the wiretaps where Hausner described himself and Sam as pioneers leading the way, and they used those words against him. Detective Oud told Hausner that he was going down in history and his face would be plastered internationally. Oud compared Hausner's attitude to that of the BTK killer, suggesting that Hausner, like Dennis Rader, secretly wanted the notoriety. To goad him further, Oud told Hausner, "You guys outdid the Baseline Rapist," pointing out that while the Baseline Rapist would likely end up in prison right behind him, Hausner would likely beat him in terms of victim count. The detectives tried to make Hausner feel that denying the crimes was robbing himself of credit for being the pioneer he claimed to be. Despite their efforts to leverage his vanity and competitive fixation on the Baseline killer, the strategy didn't induce a confession. When the fame angle failed, the detectives pivoted to shame, accusing Hausner of being a pervert who was sexually aroused by the shootings. This accusation succeeded in making Hausner visibly angry. He demanded an apology and insisted he wasn't a pervert because he had a daughter, but it didn't break his resolve. He maintained that Sam was lying to save himself, that he wasn't a murderer, and that he'd been oblivious to any killings. Sam confessed almost immediately to Schwarzkopf. When asked if he knew why he was there, he answered, "Yeah, I believe it'd be the serial shooter case." He admitted to shootings and arson. Scottsdale detective Pete Salazar took over to question Sam about the murder of Claudia Gutierrez Cruz on Thomas Road. Sam initially denied remembering the incident, claiming they only went through Scottsdale to follow a rollerblader. Salazar pressed him on the details, and Sam finally admitted he tried shooting at her and missing. He confirmed Dale handed him the gun and said it was his turn, and he admitted shooting her from the passenger seat. Detectives returned to Dale's room and played clips of Sam's confession. Dale watched Sam implicate him and maintained that Sam was lying to save himself. Mesa detective Don Byers entered to accuse Dale of killing Robin Blasnek, telling him the wiretaps would make him look like a monster in court. Dale Hausner and Sam Dietman were processed and photographed. Dale's mugshot showed a red-haired man with a face full of red whiskers and a pronounced pink complexion. Sam's mugshot showed a downcast, heavy-set man. The two men were kept separate and loaded into different vehicles for transport to the jail at 4th Avenue in Madison. They would remain in separate units and never see each other again until court proceedings. The first business day after the arrests arrived on Monday, August 7, 2006. Jail personnel sorted through media requests to interview the two suspects. Sheriff's Deputy Lindsay Smith walked the corridors with release forms, explaining to each man that anything they said to reporters could be used in court. Sam Dietman's response was immediate and unequivocal. He wanted nothing to do with the press. Dale Hausner's reaction couldn't have been more different. Deputy Smith would later describe watching his face light up, the way someone might react to receiving good news. He grabbed a pen and signed without hesitation. 3 days in custody had changed Hausner's appearance. The red-bearded man with the pompadour from Friday's mugshot was gone. Clean-shaven and groomed, he walked into a room packed with reporters and camera crews from across the country. While most defendants in his position would appear shaken or withdrawn, Hausner seemed relaxed, almost energized. He commanded the space, fielding questions and declaring his innocence with apparent conviction. Though he'd later claim guards had threatened him with weapons to force his participation, jail records showed otherwise. Officers inside the facility carried no firearms by policy, and Deputy Smith's testimony would confirm Hausner had been eager from the moment she approached his cell. The performance marked the start of what would become a pattern. Hausner hired a publicist, wrote to newspapers, and reached out to television stations, all while maintaining he'd been wrongly accused. On September 4th, Phoenix police surrounded a house on 28th Street. They were there for Mark Goudeau, a construction worker whose DNA had finally connected him to an attack from the previous September. Two sisters walking home from a park had been forced into bushes at gunpoint. One was sexually assaulted. The other, pregnant, had a gun pressed into her belly. Evidence collected that night had sat in storage for nearly a year before the match came through. The announcement sent ripples through Phoenix. Goudeau's wife Wendy gave interviews insisting the police had the wrong man, describing her husband as gentle and community-minded, someone who took pride in maintaining his lawn. She called it a miscarriage of justice. But by December, authorities would publicly state their confidence that Goudeau was responsible not just for the assault, but for the string of murders, rapes, and robberies that had terrorized South Phoenix throughout 2005 and 2006. On the morning of November 29th, Detective Cliff Jewell opened a new tip report at his desk. A woman named Carice Kane had information about Dale Hausner and a shooting at a bartending school shortly after Christmas the previous year. Jewell picked up his phone. Carice explained the situation candidly. Her husband John was in jail facing drug and weapons charges. She was pregnant and desperate for him to come home. John knew something about Hausner shooting up a car at the school where he worked, and she hoped the information might earn him consideration from prosecutors. Jewell told her he couldn't make deals. That was for the prosecutor's office. But the information interested him greatly. The moment he hung up, he called Tempe police. Did they have an unsolved shooting at a bartending school around Christmas 2005? They did. ABC Bartending School. A student's car had been riddled with bullets. What was the date? December 29th, 2005. Jewell felt the pieces clicking together. That was the night of the massive downtown spree. Tordai, Carrillo, Ortiz, the dogs. He drove to Tempe immediately and took custody of 5 bullets pulled from the victim's Chevy Cavalier. Back at headquarters, he bypassed his desk entirely and walked straight to the ballistics lab, handing over the rounds personally. 2 weeks later, the results confirmed what he'd suspected. The bullets matched casings from the Tordai shooting. The bartending school attack wasn't random. It was personal, part of the same night's rampage. 8 days later, early on a December morning, guards found Hausner unconscious in his cell. Vomit covered his jumpsuit. A letter to his brother Randy lay nearby with instructions for handling his affairs. Over 6 weeks, Hausner had stockpiled over-the-counter medications, cold pills, pain relievers, allergy tablets, hiding them inside a candy packet to avoid detection during searches. He'd swallowed more than 250 pills. Medical staff revived him, and he was moved to psychiatric observation. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. In March 2007, Jeff Hausner stood before a judge to plead guilty to stabbing Raymond McQueen outside a convenience store. Family members had written letters on his behalf, describing him as nonviolent and helpful. Jeff himself complained to the court that nobody understood his remorse, that they couldn't know what was inside him. The judge agreed, nobody did know, and noted that McQueen had come within an inch of death. The sentence was 7.5 years. That summer brought an unexpected development in Dale's publicity strategy. David Hahn Schmidt, the agent Hausner had hired to manage his media presence, was arrested in a federal sting involving attempts to extort money from Tom Cruise. While under house arrest awaiting his plea hearing, Schmidt took his own life. Hausner's pipeline to the press dried up. Mark Goudeau went to trial in September for the assault on the two sisters. The jury convicted him on all 19 counts. By December, he'd been sentenced to more than 4 centuries in prison. Christmas Day found Ron Horton at a family gathering, laughing and handing out presents in a long-sleeved shirt despite the Arizona heat. Beneath the fabric, an infection festered. He didn't want to worry his sisters or ruin the holiday. 3 weeks into January 2008, the infection killed him. His 3 young sons entered foster care. In April, Sam Dietman accepted a plea agreement. He admitted guilt in 2 murders, Claudia Gutierrez Cruz and Robin Blasnek, in exchange for dropping other charges. The deal didn't remove the possibility of execution, but his sentencing would wait until after he testified against Hausner. When asked why he was cooperating, Sam said he wanted the victims to have some measure of justice. The following month, Detective Jewell drove to visit Timothy Davenport, who'd been stabbed outside a church 2 years earlier. Jewell brought a photo array. Davenport studied the faces and pointed without hesitation to number 4. That was the driver who'd distracted him while someone else attacked. He was certain. When Schwarzkopf followed up weeks later, Davenport made the same identification. Prosecutors added the Davenport stabbing to Dale's charges and filed against Jeff as well. Jury selection for Dale Hausner's trial began on September 3, 2008. 600 potential jurors were summoned. The process would take a month to seat 12 jurors and 8 alternates, for what everyone expected would be a marathon proceeding. When Sam Dietman took the stand in January 2009, he wore prison stripes and red flip-flops designed to make running difficult. Chains connected his ankles. A SWAT presence filled the courtroom. Sam told the jury that if he were sitting in their seats, he'd vote to execute himself. He described following Dale's lead, admitted he didn't understand his own actions, and detailed the concept they'd called RVing, random recreational violence. According to Sam, Jeff Hausner had coined the term one night while they set fire to a dumpster at Jeff's apartment complex. It described their hobby, their entertainment, going out to find trouble with deadly stakes. Dale took the stand on February 2nd. He swiveled his chair to face the jurors, one arm draped casually over the rail. When his attorney asked about the note found in his apartment, the one calling someone a homicidal maniac and a god among mortals, Dale had an explanation ready. It was a joke, he said, something to help Sam attract men at a gay bar. Dale insisted he was a poor liar, hampered by a childhood speech impediment. Everything had innocent explanations. The sawed-off shotgun, the original stock pinched his chest and left marks that made dating difficult. Then came the day planners. Dale presented them as his most important evidence, personal calendars spanning 3 years, where he'd meticulously tracked his romantic life. He needed the records, he explained, to keep his various relationships straight and avoid confusion. The entries were explicit, documenting encounters with clinical detail. More importantly, nearly every date on which a serial shooter crime occurred had a corresponding entry: an overnight stay with a girlfriend, an intimate evening that placed him somewhere other than stalking victims. The prosecution called the women whose names filled those pages. Linda Swaney testified that her physical relationship with Dale had ended long before the dates he claimed they'd been together. Dr. Marianne Lesher said she wasn't with Dale on the nights the planners indicated, nights when Tony Mendez, Reggie Remillard, and Nathaniel Schaffner were killed. Michelle Bottery remembered an allergic reaction Dale described in his planner for June 11th, the night Elizabeth Clark was shot. But the reaction had actually happened in April, and she'd been at Red Lobster with her sister on the date in question, not cooking at home. The planners themselves raised questions. Police hadn't found them during the arrest search of Dale's apartment. Nobody could explain how they surfaced later or when the entries had actually been written. Prosecutor Vince Imbordino argued that trusting anything Dale wrote was impossible given his documented dishonesty. On February 10th, the defense rested. Paul Patrick, who'd nearly died from a shotgun blast while walking to buy cigarettes, testified about watching Dale in the courtroom gallery. Patrick described Dale looking directly at him and at Rebecca Estrada, David Estrada's mother, smiling, then giving them the finger in a gesture designed to look like he was simply resting his head in his hand. Then Karen Hausner entered. Dale's ex-wife wore black and trembled as she walked to the stand. Dale wouldn't look at her. She testified about things Dale had told her during their marriage, that he thought he might be gay, that he had feelings for men. This directly contradicted Dale's attacks on Sam's sexuality throughout the trial. She described her ex-husband as manipulative and cunning, a chameleon who shifted personas to suit his needs. When she called him a dangerous liar, Dale's composure shattered. He began sobbing, wiping tears from his face. The judge called a recess. 2 days passed before Dale could bring himself to return to the courtroom. On Tuesday, February 24, 2009, prosecutor Laura Reckart stood before 20 jurors, 10 men and 10 women, and began speaking. She would continue for the entire day. Her opening salvo came from Dale Hausner's own words, captured on the wiretap that the task force had installed in his Mesa apartment. "I love shooting people in the back. It's so much fun." She let the words hang in the air, then pointed at the man seated at the defense table. What had been a whodunit, she told the jury, was now a he did it. Reckart built her case around a theory of motive that had nothing to do with money or revenge or any rational purpose. She argued that Dale Hausner craved fame and notoriety above all else. Every aspect of his life pointed toward this hunger for celebrity. He had tried his hand at stand-up comedy. He had produced a cable television show. He photographed famous boxers. After his arrest, he held a press conference from jail. All of it, Reckart argued, was the behavior of a man desperate to be known. She showed the jury newspaper clippings that investigators had found in Hausner's possession. The articles described the arson fires at 2 Walmart stores on June 8, 2006. At the time those stories were published, the fires had not been publicly connected to the serial shooter investigation. Only someone who set the fires would have known to save them. Reckart called them trophies. She played audio from the wiretaps where Hausner told Sam Dietman he wanted to be a legend, a pioneer. The map that Detective Travis Bird had pulled from a trash bag during surveillance became a centerpiece of her presentation. Reckart traced her finger along a blue pencil line drawn across Van Buren Street. There were too many crime scenes in this area to mark individually, she explained. This was where he preferred to hunt. Then she walked the jury through the route that Hausner and Dietman had driven on the night of August 2, 2006, while undercover officers followed. The silver Camry had made a deliberate detour to pass behind Phoenix Police Headquarters. Reckart argued that this was not an accident or a wrong turn. It was mockery, consistent with the recordings where Hausner taunted law enforcement for their inability to catch him. The defense strategy relied heavily on shifting blame to Sam Dietman. Reckart dismantled this systematically. She played portions of the wiretap where Dietman said, "Mine was May of this year," suggesting that Hausner's crimes had begun months earlier. She contrasted the two men for the jury. Dietman had cooperated with investigators, taken responsibility for his actions, and testified truthfully despite facing execution. Hausner had done none of these things. Hausner's primary defense came in the form of day planners that he claimed proved he was elsewhere when the crimes occurred. Reckart held nothing back in her assessment of these documents. She called them pathetic attempts at creating alibis after the fact, supposedly maintained by a man who described himself as a ladies' man juggling multiple relationships. When the women named in those planners testified, their accounts contradicted what Hausner had written. His alibis became what Reckart termed alley lies. She reminded the jury that Hausner had a documented history of dishonesty. He had lied to police during interviews, he had lied to reporters, he had lied to employers. Now, she argued, he was lying to them. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. She focused on one alibi in particular, the night when Timothy Davenport was stabbed in a church parking lot. Hausner testified that he was miles away at his apartment complex, using a payphone to locate his missing cell phone. The prosecution had subpoenaed records from the phone company. Those records proved that the specific payphones Hausner claimed to have used showed no activity during the time he described. After 5 hours on her feet, Reckart turned to face Dale Hausner directly. She stared at him and delivered her final line. "Gotcha! Dale Sean Hausner, your fun is over." The following day belonged to the defense. Attorney Ken Everett rose to make his closing argument. He compared what was happening in the courtroom to Arthur Miller's play The Crucible, invoking the Salem witch trials and the dangers of mass hysteria. He attacked Sam Dietman as a liar and a snitch, calling him the linchpin of the prosecution's entire case. The girlfriends who testified against Dale, Everett argued, were simply trying to distance themselves from someone accused of being a serial killer. Throughout his lawyer's presentation, Dale appeared relaxed. He nodded when Everett made points he agreed with. He shook his head at statements he disputed. Thursday morning arrived and victim Paul Patrick was not in the courtroom. Someone found him collapsed in his apartment. He had suffered a massive stroke. Paramedics rushed him to a neurological center where surgeons made a decision that saved his life. They removed the right half of his skull and placed it in a freezer. This would allow his brain to swell without the pressure killing him. While Paul Patrick fought for his life in surgery, prosecutor Vince Imbordino stood before the jury to deliver the state's rebuttal. He held a coil of rope and used it to demonstrate how individual strands of evidence, weak on their own, twisted together into something unbreakable. He quoted Dean Koontz on the nature of evil. He quoted Confucius on wickedness and small men. When he spoke about the dogs that had been killed, his voice broke. If those animals could be in the courtroom, he said, they would nuzzle Dale Hausner's neck. At noon, Judge Steinle gave the jury their instructions. 8 alternates were dismissed. The 12 who remained left to begin deliberations. Paul Patrick lay in intensive care, a ventilator breathing for him, a feeding tube sustaining him, the left side of his body paralyzed. The jury deliberated through Friday and into the following week. Paul Patrick's condition worsened. On Sunday night, March 8th, neurosurgeons opened him up again in an emergency procedure. His family gathered and began preparing themselves for what seemed inevitable. Detective Cliff Jewell made a phone call to the hospital the next morning. He told the staff that he believed Paul was going to die and asked them to contact him when it happened so he could complete the necessary paperwork for the medical examiner. Jewell had made calls like this before. He had noticed over the years that whenever he called the hospital expecting a victim to die, that victim somehow rallied. He considered it a superstition, but he did it anyway. On Tuesday, March 10th, Paul Patrick began breathing without the ventilator. 3 days later, the jury announced they had reached a verdict. The Hausner family took their seats in the courtroom. Dale's mother, Rosemary, sat with his brothers Randy and Gregory. Rebecca Estrada, whose son David had been murdered on a sidewalk near a Jack in the Box in Tolleson, was also there. The clerk began reading. Not guilty on count 1, not guilty on count 2, not guilty on count 3, not guilty on count 4. Then the clerk read guilty for count 5, the murder of David Estrada. Guilty for count 6. Rebecca Estrada broke down sobbing. When the clerk finished, Dale Hausner had been convicted of 80 of the 87 charges against him. In his hospital room, Paul Patrick watched the verdict on television. 4 days later, on St. Patrick's Day, Paul had a visitor who wore a leprechaun hat. Paul smiled. He whispered his first coherent words since the stroke, "Faith and Begorra." By the following Saturday, he had regained full consciousness and told his visitor he was too mean to die. He said he had things to do, specifically for Rebecca Estrada. He had made a promise to represent the victims, and he intended to keep it. The penalty phase began on Thursday, March 26. Adriana Gutierrez Cruz, whose sister Claudia had been shot while walking home from work, spoke to the court. She addressed her dead sister directly, asking forgiveness for failing to protect her. Rebecca Estrada spoke about David. Dale Hausner waived his right to present evidence that might convince the jury to spare his life, but he asked to make a statement. The judge allowed it. Hausner told the jurors that they had believed Sam Dietman instead of him, and he accepted their decision. He said the name Hausner now carried the same stigma as the name Manson. He told them that he had already experienced death in 1994 when his 2 young sons drowned in Richland Creek. Then he told the jury to give him death, claiming it would send a message to what he called liberal bleeding heart countries. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours the next day. They returned with their decision: 6 death sentences. As bailiffs led him from the courtroom, Hausner turned to the jurors and thanked them. They looked away. That afternoon, Detective Cliff Jewell went to see Paul Patrick in the hospital. Paul showed Jewell his bandaged hand, injured when he collapsed during the stroke. He made a joke about his skull sitting in a freezer somewhere, saying he hoped the hospital staff didn't put it with the lunches. In May, Jeff Hausner was convicted of stabbing Timothy Davenport in a church parking lot. Davenport had been slashed across the face and stabbed in the back on May 17, 2006, while Dale Hausner allegedly sat in the driver's seat of a car, creating a distraction. This was Jeff's second conviction for stabbing someone. Mark Goudeau had already been convicted once, in 2007, for sexually assaulting 2 sisters. Now, in April 2011, he faced trial for murder. Jury selection began on the 19th. In October, news outlets reported that forensic evidence, including blood samples and rings, definitively linked Goudeau to the Baseline killer attacks. On October 31st, the jury found him guilty of 67 felony counts. All 9 murders attributed to the Baseline killer were included in the verdict. A month later, Judge Roland Steinle sentenced Goudeau to death 9 times. He received an additional 1,324 years for the other 58 crimes. Combined with the 438 years he had received for the sexual assaults, Goudeau's total prison sentence, not counting the death penalties, came to 1,762 years and 3 months. In October 2015, Mark Goudeau's attorney stood before the Arizona Supreme Court and argued that his client should have been tried separately for each murder and for certain other charges. 8 months later, on June 17, 2016, the court issued its ruling. All 9 death sentences were upheld. The more than 60 other felony convictions were upheld. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. The jury considered Sam Dietman's cooperation when they deliberated his fate. In July 2009, they sentenced him to life in prison without parole. He would never leave. Hausner waived his right to appeal. He told the court he wanted to be executed as soon as possible so the victims' families could begin to heal. But the machinery of death penalty cases moves slowly, even when the condemned is willing. Hausner would spend years on death row at Arizona State Prison. However, on June 19, 2013, correctional officers at Arizona State Prison found Dale Hausner unresponsive in his cell. He died later that day. The autopsy found no evidence of violence. The medical examiner determined that Hausner had swallowed a lethal dose of antidepressant medication, taking his own life 4 years after being sentenced to death. Between May 2005 and August 2006, during those 15 months when Dale Hausner and Sam Dietman drove through Phoenix in a silver Camry, they murdered 8 people and wounded at least 19 others. Some estimates put the number of human victims even higher. They killed horses, dogs, and wounded a burro. They set fires and shot out windows. The attacks happened at the same time another serial killer was operating in the city. The two crime sprees created a climate of terror unlike anything the city had experienced. When the shootings began, Cliff Jewell noticed patterns that other investigators dismissed. The FBI profilers insisted that the .22 caliber attacks and the shotgun attacks were the work of different offenders. The profile said so. The behavioral analysis said so. Jewell disagreed. What Jewell saw was a thread that ran through both the animal attacks and the human murders. The animals were not separate incidents. They were part of the same spree. He dug a bullet out of a shed wall at the Travis family home with his own hands. He refused to let evidence slip away. Without Jewell's refusal to accept the conventional wisdom that the crimes were unrelated, the serial shooter investigation might have gone in an entirely different direction. After the trial concluded and Dale Hausner was sent to death row, Jewell continued his work with the Phoenix Police Department. He had spent decades as a detective, solving cases that others overlooked, giving voice to victims who could not speak for themselves. When he finally retired, he left behind a legacy that extended far beyond a single case, no matter how significant.